Chapter 7. 3:15 p.m. Nate charged back to the waterfront. His best hope was to catch Valerie back to Connecticut. He'd figured out what to do when he got there. If he couldn't sneak onto the Valerie like last time, he'd beg the captain to take him. He'd offered to scrub the decks, carry out the dead rats, anything. But Nate was too late. He reached the dock just as the Valerie was sailing away. He tore down the dock, yelling, "Stop! Wait! Come back!" But the sailors couldn't hear him. And even if they could, Nate knew the captain wouldn't turn the ship around for some nobody kid. Now what would Nate do? He stared out into the harbor as though the answer might be floating in the water. And that's when he spotted them. Two enormous sailing ships. They were coming from the south and seemed to be heading right for the city. Nate's heart lifted up. Maybe he'd find a job after all. But as the ships came closer, he realized they were not regular sailing ships like Papa's. They were bigger. They rose proudly out of the water, each with 12 sparkling white sails gleaming in the sun. As they turned slightly, Nate saw that both ships had small square openings along the sides, and poking out of each square was the black muzzle of a cannon. They were like gigantic black serpents peering out from their caves. Flags of England flapped from the ship's masts. They were British warships. Nate stared with a mix of fear and fascination, like the time he found a scorpion in his hammock. All his life, he'd been hearing stories about the British Navy. It was the mightiest on earth, with hundreds of warships prowling the seas. The greatest British warship of them all were called men of war, floating cities that could hold 1,000 men and almost 100 big cannons. Each cannon could blast a 24-pound ball that would streak through the air faster than a person could blink. That's hard to visualize, isn't it? There was no weapon on earth as powerful as a big cannon. Nate knew it took 5 men to load and fire each one. One ball could punch through a stone fortress wall. It could rip through a line of soldiers. It could turn a house to rubble. It could blow a hole in an enemy warship, dooming it to an underwater grave. But the crew of a big warship didn't just fire off one cannonball at a time. They fired dozens of cannons at once, unleashing a crushing wave of metal balls. A man of war could destroy a city within hours. Nate's blood turned cold as he watched the 2 warships stream around the southern tip of the city. A crowd of American soldiers had joined Nate on the dock. They shouted out curses and shook their fists. And then a thundering explosion shook the ground. Kaboom! The explosion rattled Nate's bones and almost sent him leaping into the water in fear. But then he realized that the blast hadn't come from either of the British ships. Across the river in Brooklyn, big puffs of gray smoke rose up from a hilltop. When the curtain of smoke cleared, Nate could see 10 cannons lined up in a row. Kaboom! 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 They blasted away at the British ships. And then came blasts from somewhere closer on this side of the river. The Americans must have put cannons all around the city. Soldiers were crowding the docks now. 2 men stood behind Nate. They screamed out insults to the British ships. "Putting on a little show for us, you devils," one jeered. "We'll blast you up to the moon." The American cannons thundered and boomed. The air was filled with the sharp metal stink of gunpowder smoke. Soldiers whooped and cheered after every blast. Kaboom! Huzzah! Kaboom! Huzzah! None of the American cannonballs hit the ships. Each splashed down harmlessly in the river. But the soldiers didn't seem to care. They roared and taunted. "Sink those cowards!" But then Nate noticed that the bigger of the British warships had slowed down. A tongue of flame flicked out of one of its cannons. I love the figurative language. Kaboom! It's an odd sizzling sound. An odd sizzling sound filled the sky overhead. Someone screamed, and then crash! A cannonball came down, smashing a house just a few yards from where Nate stood. The ground shook. Shards of wood rained down. A man shouted out, "Run!" That's chapter 7.
Why would they do?
Chapter 8. Nate took off, joining the stampede of terrified soldiers rushing away from the docks. He ended up alone in an alley, huddling in the doorway of a stone building. He knew trying to hide was useless. No building would protect him from the force of a cannonball. But he couldn't just stand out in the street. He squeezed himself tighter into the doorway and tried not to think about the gruesome stories Papa's men used to tell about men who'd had their heads blown off by cannonballs. What a fool Nate was. He'd never make it out of here on his own. He wasn't tough like Slash O'Shea. When Slash was just 14, the merchant ship he worked on was destroyed in a storm. Only a few men survived, including Slash. And what did he do next? He joined the British Navy. England was in the middle of a huge war with France and Spain. Slash was stationed on a man of war on the cannon deck. He was a powder monkey, which meant it was his job to rush heavy bags of explosive gunpowder to the men loading the cannons. Powder monkeys had to be small and fast like real monkeys and as brave as lions. Cannons didn't just kill the enemy. Sudden sparks, too much gunpowder, any small mistake could cause an accidental explosion. It was one of those fiery accidents that left Slash without his right hand. After that, the Navy didn't want him anymore. But Slash didn't curl up like a little shrimp. No, he went on to be the greatest pirate ever. Thinking about Slash calmed Nate down a bit and put that strong, shimmering feeling inside his chest again. Nate closed his eyes and pictured Papa's face. He tried to imagine Eliza's hand gripping his. When Nate finally opened his eyes, the explosions had faded. The smoke had mostly cleared. Those British warships must have sailed away. Nate unpeeled himself from the stone wall. Now he just wanted to get out of this battlefield. And if he couldn't escape on a boat, he'd just have to walk. The whiff of gunpowder still prickled Nate's nose, but the danger seemed to have passed. The soldiers on the streets were back to work with their shovels and axes. Nate walked north, hoping to find the road out of the city. He passed a big lawn that had turned into a huge army camp. Every inch of grass was covered with tents. Row after crooked row of the grimiest, droopiest tents Nate had ever seen. Nate wove through a crowd of soldiers building an enormous wall out of dirt and bricks. A man's voice shouted out from somewhere behind him, "Nate!"
It's that guy.
Nate ignored it. There had to be dozens of Nathaniels in this city. But then the voice shouted out again, "Nathaniel Fox!" Nate's heart stopped. His mind spun until he understood who it had to be. One of Storch's men? His wretched uncle had a whole crew of muscled bullies he hired to collect money from people who owed him. And now one of those men had tracked Nate down. He was going to drag him back to Storch for more beatings. Nate took off in a panic. He sprinted across the street. He had just made it when a strong hand grabbed hold of the back of his shirt. Nate wriggled and squirmed until he wrenched himself free. He whirled around and raised his fist, ready to fight. He lifted his chin and stared dead on into the face of the man chasing him. And then Nate's mouth fell open in shock. It was a young soldier with a goofy, gap-toothed smile. A mop of bright red curls spilled out from under a crumpled green triangle hat. Before Nate could say anything, the man grabbed Nate into a crushing, joyful hug. It was his old friend from Papa's crew, Paul Dobbins.